Was legendary FISA president Jean-Marie Balestre really as tough as they say? I mean, today's deep dive throws us right into the thick of it, the high-octane world of 1980s Formula One, to examine his, well, let's just say tumultuous relationship with the one and only Ayrton Senna.
One of the greats.
Absolutely. But was Balestre really biased against drivers from outside Europe, as some people claim, or is there something more to this story? We've got some intriguing excerpts to dig into today, a mix of sources, including first-hand accounts, even one from someone claiming to have been a track marshal, get this, at the 1987 Mexican Grand Prix.
It never ceases to amaze me how these stories, even after all these years, still get people so fired up. We're talking official records, first-hand accounts, rumors, speculation, and not all of it adds up. Should be interesting to see what conclusions, if any, we can draw.
Right. Okay, so let's unpack this. For those who might not know, FISA, that's the Fédération Internationale du Sport Automobile, it was the governing body for Formula One back then. And Balestre, as president, well, he held a lot of power, had a big influence over the sport. So when this former track marshal comes forward and claims Balestre had it out for Senna, specifically because Senna was Latin American, well, it definitely raises some eyebrows.
No doubt. It suggests a potential bias, and this was an era when European teams and European drivers, they were really the dominant force in F1. It really goes to the heart of a much bigger issue, a conversation about power dynamics and potential biases in motorsport.
It really does. And we're not just talking about vague accusations either. This source goes as far as alleging a specific incident at the 1986 Mexican Grand Prix. Apparently, Senna went off track, and then get this, he was left stranded in a dangerous position by track marshals, allegedly on Balestre's orders.
And to make matters worse, Balestre then hit Senna with a hefty fine for this incident. It definitely points to some animosity, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, and it gets even wilder. According to this source, while Senna was stuck there, track marshals were allegedly shouting racial slurs at him. He claims he witnessed this firsthand.
Now, we do have to acknowledge that right now this is a single source making some very serious claims.
Yeah.
Without any further corroboration, it's tough to definitively verify.
For sure. We have to consider the source's perspective and any potential biases, right? We're not saying this is the absolute truth, but, and this is a big but, even if we take this particular account with a grain of salt, it still makes you wonder, was this an isolated incident, or is there a pattern of behavior here? Were other drivers on the receiving end of Balestre's, shall we say, unique management style?
That's the million-dollar question. To get to the bottom of it, we need to look at some other controversial moments in F1 history, particularly those involving Balestre. A good example is the infamous 1984 Monaco Grand Prix, a race that many believe really cemented this image of Balestre as someone who was not afraid to use his influence, let's say.
This was the race with the controversial red flag, right? Set the scene for us. What made this race so pivotal in this whole Senna-Balestre saga?
Picture this. Torrential rain. A young Ayrton Senna, already showing glimpses of the brilliance that would make him a legend, driving a Tolman, not exactly known for its speed,
Right.
but in those treacherous conditions. Senna was in his element, absolutely scything through the field. He was catching Alain Prost, who was leading the race, and he was catching him fast.
Oh, I can already sense this isn't going to end well for Senna.
It doesn't. Just Senna's about to challenge for the lead. The race director, under what many believe to be pressure from Balestre, mind you, throws a red flag.
Ending the race prematurely.
Ending the race prematurely and effectively robbing Senna of a potential first-ever Grand Prix victory. Exactly. The red flag, while not unheard of in those days, seemed premature to many, especially given the dramatic way it all went down, with Senna on the charge. This decision really fueled the narrative that Balestre was biased against drivers like Senna, drivers who were seen as disruptors, who were shaking things up in a sport that was, let's face it, pretty set in its ways.
So this red flag incident, it wasn't just about one race, was it? It's like it really cemented this image of Balestre as, I don't know, someone who, like, wasn't afraid to throw his weight around, maybe even impacting entire careers.
No question. And you see this same pattern, maybe even more so, in another controversial decision a few years later, this time at the 1989 Japanese Grand Prix, the race that would decide the championship.
Man, Senna and Prost, that rivalry was at its peak that year. It must have been electric. Remind us what went down.
He was a pressure cooker, that's for sure. Senna and Prost, teammates at McLaren, but at each other's throats for the title. And then they collide on the track.
Oh, wow.
Senna, amazingly, manages to get back on track, pits for repairs, and still, somehow, crosses the finish line first.
What a finish. Talk about a nail-biter. So that's it. Senna wins, right? End of story.
Not quite. The stewards, with Balestre's influence looming large, disqualify Senna for cutting the chicane after that collision with Prost.
No
It's a
way.
huge controversy, a decision that handed the championship to Prost and just added more fuel to the fire to those accusations that Balestre had out for Senna.
Hold on. I remember something about Ballister actually confronting Senna after this race physically. What was that about?
You're right, there's another layer to this whole thing. Witnesses say that as Senna was about to head up to the podium, Balestre actually steps in front of him, blocks his path, and says something like, "You're not going to win this one."
You're kidding. Talk about rubbing salt in the wound. If that's true, it really makes you wonder about Ballestre's motivations. Was it just a personal thing with Senna, or was it something more?
That's the million-dollar question. Some people argue that Balestre is just a strong leader, a guy who did things his way, upholding the rules as he saw them. But then you have these stories, these incidents, that paint a different picture, a picture of a man with, let's just say, strong opinions and maybe not afraid to interfere. Okay, so we've got the 1986 Mexican Grand Prix, the 1984 Monaco Grand Prix, and now this, the 1989 Japanese Grand Prix. 3 separate incidents, years apart, and every time it's Senna on the losing end of Ballestre's authority. Hard not to see a pattern there. But was Senna alone? Were there other drivers who felt the sharp end of Ballestre's gavel, so to speak?
That's a great question, and it brings us back to that former track marshal and his story about the 1987 Mexican Grand Prix.
Ah, right. He mentioned Nigel Mansell, said he might have lost the championship that year because of some, shall we say, unusual behavior from, if I'm remembering this right, Mexican track marshals.
That's the one. He was a bit vague on the details, but suggested pretty strongly that their actions were deliberate, even orchestrated to mess with Mansell's race, ultimately costing him the championship. Now that is interesting, especially considering everything else we've been talking about. Makes you think, was there a broader pattern of these questionable incidents, particularly in races held outside of Europe during Ballestre's time as president? Is it possible that this alleged bias wasn't just about Senna, but maybe about non-European drivers more generally?
It's definitely something to think about. If true, this Mansell incident takes on a whole new meaning. It suggests that there might have been a systemic problem within the sport at the time, something that goes beyond individual drivers and points to something, well, a bit more troubling.
This is where things get really interesting, right? It's bigger than just he said, she said. We're talking about a potentially significant systemic problem.
Exactly. But we need to be careful about jumping to conclusions. We're dealing with a lot of speculation here, conjecture.
Right, of course. But you have to admit, it's all starting to feel a bit like a giant high-octane conspiracy.
Maybe. Or maybe there's another explanation. What we need to do is look at these incidents, Ballestre's actions, in the context of the sport at the time. Formula One in the 80s, it was intense, high stakes, and Balestre was a powerful figure, no doubt. But was he really acting out of malice? Or was he, as some argue, a product of his time? Just a man trying to control a sport undergoing huge changes? Big questions, worth exploring.
It's wild to think about how, the whole culture of a sport might actually shape the people in charge. Was Ballister just a product of a less inclusive era in Formula One, or was there something more intentional, more calculated about his actions?
That's the question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. And to really get a grip on it, we've got to look beyond these individual incidents. Look at Ballestre's whole approach. For instance, did you know this guy once sued a race director for defamation?
Whoa, seriously. Guess those forceful personality descriptions weren't kidding? What was that all about?
Well, it all came from accusations of favoritism towards certain teams. Something that was talked about in hushed tones during Ballestre's reign. He denied it all vehemently and took legal action, wanted to clear his name. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was a full-on legal battle. Makes you think, why go to such lengths? Was he really just trying to protect his reputation, or was this about silencing critics, consolidating power?
It's interesting how this all comes back to control, right? We're talking allegations of bias against certain drivers, and now this whole thing with the race director. It paints a picture of a guy who, well, let's just say, he wasn't afraid to throw his weight around.
And that's what makes this so fascinating, right? It forces us to consider the bigger picture. If Balestre was biased, what does that tell us about how Formula One operated back then? Did the system allow for these biases to thrive? Or, to play devil's advocate a bit, were these just judgment calls made under a ton of pressure, blown out of proportion by the media, by the crazy world of Formula One?
Those are some seriously thought-provoking questions, and I don't think there are any easy answers. We're left with these hints, these glimpses into the past, but without a time machine, we'll never really know what was going on in Balestre's head.
The beauty and the frustration of history, eh? We can analyze, we can weigh perspectives, but at the end of the day, we have to form our own conclusions. This deep dive has given us a lot to chew on about Ballister, that's for sure, but it's also raised some bigger questions about power, about ambition, and about how Formula One has or hasn't evolved over the years.
Absolutely. We started this whole thing with a mystery, right? Was Jean-Marie Balestre biased against certain drivers? And we may not have a clear-cut answer, but we've uncovered a fascinating, complicated story, one that goes way beyond a simple yes or no. We've seen how individual actions, decisions made in a sport that was changing rapidly, could have lasting effects. And maybe, just maybe, that's the biggest takeaway here. What do you think?
Couldn't agree more. History's rarely black and white. The most interesting stories, they usually live in those gray areas.
Well said. Well said. And for everyone listening, maybe this sparks a question or two for you. How much has Formula One really changed since Ballestre's time? Are we any closer to a level playing field? Or do those ghosts of the past still linger in the roar of those engines? Something to think about. Until next time, this is The Deep Dive, signing off.